My stepfather looked at me and said nothing. His breathing was heavy. Tension pulsed in the air. I felt his gaze with every cell of my body, and before I knew it, I stopped looking away. This shouldn't have happened. Not like this. Not with him. But the line was erased, and now it's too late. I'm 19. And I can't pretend nothing's happening anymore. It took me a moment to realize what had happened that night, when I found myself alone in the house, my stepfather struggling to breathe, clutching his chest as if something was pulling him down, not allowing him to take even one full breath. For the first few seconds, I couldn't comprehend how serious it was, but his expression, distorted with pain, his tense fingers, frantically searching for any kind of support, made me act faster than I could think about the consequences. I grabbed the phone without thinking, automatically calling an ambulance, trying to speak as clearly as possible, although my voice was shaking and my fingers were clinging to the body of the phone, as if something more than just the ability to quickly dial a number depended on it. When the dispatcher asked questions about his condition, I could barely squeeze out meaningful words because my mind was focused on only one thing: that he should not lose consciousness, that something irreparable should not happen. Because at that moment I felt for the first time that his life was in my hands, and that I could not allow anything to happen to him. Waiting for the doctors to arrive seemed like the longest time in my life, because every second spent trying to keep him conscious turned into torture, and the tense air in the room seemed to press on me, forcing me to feel the weight of responsibility for everything that was happening. When the door opened and the doctors came in, I couldn't step aside right away because my body seemed to have grown to the spot while they examined me, made a diagnosis, and spoke professional terms to each other that meant nothing to me but inspired some kind of painful fear. At that moment, I realized that I didn't care what would happen next, didn't care what the doctors would say, didn't care how long it would take him to recover. The main thing was that he was alive and that I hadn't made the worst mistake that could have changed my life forever. When he was taken away, I was left in the empty house, sitting in the very place where he had been struggling to breathe just a few minutes earlier, and I couldn't understand why there was no relief inside, why there was a tightness in my chest, why his face, distorted with pain, was still before my eyes. That night, I couldn't close my eyes, because a strange anxiety raged inside me, preventing me from casting aside thoughts of what might have happened if I hadn't come home at that moment, if I had stayed even a few minutes longer, if he had been left alone and no one could help him. The next morning, my mother called me from the hospital, telling me that he had come to, that his condition had stabilized, that everything would be fine now. But even these words could not remove the strange feeling that had settled inside me and did not want to go away. When I arrived at the hospital and saw him, for the first time in a long time, I caught myself thinking that I was looking at him differently, that he was no longer just the person with whom we lived under the same roof, but someone else, someone for whom I now felt something completely new. He looked at me as if he was trying to say something he couldn't put into words, and I just nodded, not knowing what to say, not understanding why everything inside me was turning over from that one look. I left the room, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, and only then did I understand that from that very moment when I saw him helpless, when I realized that his life depended on me, something had changed between us, and there was no turning back. After being discharged from the hospital, Victor returned home, followed the doctor's orders, took his medications as prescribed, and avoided physical activity, but spent most of his time in the living room, sitting in a chair with a book in his hands or watching television, which did not interest him at all. His mother took care of him, but she did not last long, because work required attention, and soon she began to stay late again, leaving me alone with him in the house, which was now strangely quiet. I was often there, at first by accident, then on purpose, going into the kitchen when he was there, sitting in the living room with his phone when he turned on the news, but I hardly looked at the screen because I noticed how he occasionally glanced in my direction. These glances became longer, more attentive. There was something in them that I had not seen before, but now I could not ignore, and I did not need words to understand that he, too, had begun to notice the changes between us. One evening I walked into the living room and saw him rubbing his temples with his fingers, his eyes closed as if trying to shake off the fatigue, but as soon as I took a step closer, he immediately opened his eyes and looked straight at me, holding them for a moment longer than was necessary. I walked past him, feeling the air in the room become thicker, the tension hanging between us. Something in his presence began to change the usual boundaries, and even if I wanted to pretend that nothing was happening, I could no longer do so. The next day, I returned home a little earlier than usual, walked into the kitchen, smelled the coffee, and saw him standing at the stove, holding a cup in one hand and a spoon in the other, stirring milk in a saucepan. I lingered by the door, watching him move, how confidently he held his back despite his recent weakness, as if he wanted to prove that he was okay, that he was no longer the one who needed saving. I came closer, deliberately taking my time, picked up a glass of water, took a slow sip, felt him look at me again, but I didn't take my eyes off my fingers, slowly running their tips over the cold glass. He was silent too, but there were more words in that silence than in any conversation, because now we both understood that something had arisen between us that was difficult to call an accident. That same evening, as I sat in my room scrolling through my phone feed, I heard footsteps in the hallway, felt something inside me tense up, listened, but the door didn't open, and only a few seconds later the footsteps moved away. I looked up at my reflection in the mirror, saw my face, which seemed different, more focused, more serious, more mature, and suddenly realized that everything was different now, that even if I told myself that it was just my imagination, I myself would find it hard to believe it. The next day, my mother was late at work, and I was alone in the house with him, hearing him move around the rooms, opening cabinets, turning on the TV but never staying on one channel for more than a few seconds, as if he couldn't find what he really wanted to watch. I left the room, walked down the hall, saw him standing by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, and at that moment he turned his head, meeting my gaze with a look that seemed too direct, too searching, too frank. I walked further, feeling that gaze lingering on me, as if its presence had become something tangible, as if every step I took now felt different, as if something had irreversibly changed in the space that had once been an ordinary home, but had now become a place where every moment mattered. With each passing day, I noticed more and more how his behavior changed, how his gaze lingered on me longer, how his presence was felt more strongly, even when there were no words or touches between us. He did nothing extra, said nothing unusual, but every gesture, every brief moment when our eyes met, began to mean more than just coincidences. I couldn't pinpoint when exactly I began to catch myself waiting for these moments, wanting to see how he looked away, how his fingers nervously touched the edge of the table, how he pretended that nothing was happening. That evening, I lingered in the kitchen, pretending to just drink tea, but in reality, I watched him sitting in the living room, leaning against the back of the sofa, his expression relaxed yet tense. At one point, he turned his head, looked straight at me, and this gaze lasted so long that I had to pretend that I was just checking something on my phone, because if I didn't look away, the tension would become too obvious. The next day, I decided to see how far I could push him, how aware he was of what was going on between us, how much of his attention was truly on me. I chose form-fitting clothes, walked down the stairs a little more slowly than usual, knowing he was down there, knowing he would hear my footsteps and look. And he did. I felt his gaze before I saw him, before he lifted his head slightly from the TV screen and focused his attention exactly where I expected it to. I walked past him, pretended not to notice, but every step, every turn of my head felt different than before, as if I had entered a game whose rules I didn't yet fully understand. I sat down at the table, opened the book, but I couldn't focus on the text because I felt his presence, his breathing, his attempt to act normal, although normal no longer existed. When I returned to my room, I looked at my reflection in the mirror for a long time, trying to understand what was happening to me, why it was his gaze that made me feel something I hadn't felt before. But there was no answer, because now everything had changed, and even if I wanted to turn back, it was impossible to do so. Later, when the house was quiet at night, I heard him walking down the hall, his steps slowing at my door, pausing for a few seconds before moving on. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there, knew he was hesitating, knew that if he took another step he wouldn't be able to stop. I listened to the silence, which was now filled with something new, something that was slowly spiraling out of control, something that couldn't be ignored. The next morning I left the room earlier than usual, pretending everything was as before, but I felt him looking at me again, as if he was waiting, as if he wanted to know if I was as aware of it as he was. We hadn't talked about it, hadn't acknowledged it out loud, but now it was no longer a mind game, it was a reality from which there was no escape. Time in the house flowed differently, as if the air between us had become denser, as if every movement, every glance had acquired a hidden meaning that had not existed before. Now even the simplest things felt different: morning breakfast, chance encounters in the hallway, Short moments when we found ourselves in the same room without strangers. Victor said nothing. I didn't make any unnecessary movements either, but inside I felt that the border between us that had existed before had long since disappeared. I began to notice how he responded to my presence, how he would pretend to be completely absorbed in his work, but as soon as I passed by, his gaze would rise, lingering just long enough for me to notice. He would take his time leaving if he found himself in the same room with me, but he would not take a single step forward, as if he were testing how long we could maintain this tension without words, without touching, without confessing. One evening, my mother was late at work, and I went down to the living room, pretending that I just wanted to sit in front of the TV, but really expecting him to be there. He did come out of the office a few minutes later, sat down on the couch, picked up the remote, but didn't change the channel, as if he was expecting something. I stretched out slowly in the chair, brushed my hair off my shoulder, feeling him hold his breath for just a split second before returning to a neutral expression. I listened to the ticking of the clock, the hum of the air conditioner, but the main thing was something else: his silent presence, the awareness that he felt me as keenly as I felt him. At some point, I stood up, walked past him, feeling his gaze on my back, went upstairs, stopped at my door, as if giving him time to think. For a few seconds, nothing happened, but I knew he was there, that he hadn't turned off the TV, hadn't left, but was just sitting there, staring into space and thinking about something he shouldn't be thinking about. The next morning I was acting as usual, but I deliberately lingered a little longer in the kitchen, choosing my clothes to test how far he was willing to go in his silent observation. He didn't say anything unnecessary, but his movements became a little slower, his gaze a little more attentive, as if he himself was not aware of how his behavior was changing. A few days later we were alone in the house again, and when I got out of the shower, I threw on a towel, taking my time going into my room. The hallway was quiet, but I knew he was nearby, knew he could see me, but I pretended nothing out of the ordinary was happening. I paused by the mirror, smoothed my hair, took a few steps further before disappearing through the door, but all the while I felt his attention, invisible, but absolutely real. Later, as the evening wore on, I realized that this game between us was now taking shape, that it wasn't just casual glances or momentary weaknesses, but something more, something that couldn't be contained once it started to come out. I realized that everything was moving toward a moment when one of us would stop holding back, when something would change irreversibly, and the strangest thing was that I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The house was increasingly becoming a space filled with a silent tension that had become familiar to us. We didn't talk about it, didn't make any sudden movements, but it all happened on its own, as if an invisible force was imperceptibly moving us closer to each other. Glances lingered a little longer than was appropriate, accidental touches, even through the air, became tangible, and moments when we were alone took on a whole new meaning. That evening, Mom was working late again, and I decided to leave the room, although I knew perfectly well that he would be in the living room. I took my time, moving smoothly, feeling how the air between us thickened with each step I took. He was sitting in a chair, holding a book in his hands, but as soon as I appeared in his field of vision, he seemed to lose interest in it. I pretended not to notice his gaze, walked to the shelf, ran my fingers along the spines of the books, arching my back a little more, as if I was simply stretching after sitting for a long time. I heard him put the book down, heard his breathing deepen a little, but I continued to act as if it was an accident, as if I was just minding my own business. When I turned around, he was looking at me as if it was more than just a look, something he was trying to hold inside himself but couldn't. I sat down on the arm of the sofa, finding a comfortable position, my legs stretched out and slightly crossed at the ankles. The TV was playing quietly in the background, but neither of us were paying attention. Victor sat still, but his fingers trembled slightly, as if he was holding something back inside himself, as if he was struggling with something that had been wanting to come out for a long time. For a minute, then another, the room remained filled with this silent tension, as if even the air around us knew that something important was about to happen. I slowly extended my hand, reaching for the remote control lying between us, and at that moment I felt his knee accidentally brush my thigh. The touch was too light, too casual, but it struck a nerve harder than if he had touched me consciously. I didn't pull my hand away right away, allowing myself to linger for a split second to fully experience this moment, but the next moment he pulled away abruptly, as if he remembered that he couldn't. He rose from the chair so quickly that it creaked under his weight, ran his hand over his face, pretending that he just needed to leave, and headed into the hallway, leaving me alone in the room. I didn't move, didn't react, just watched the back of the retreating silhouette, realizing that this moment could have been a turning point, that a little more and he wouldn't have been able to hold back. But he still left, leaving the border untouched, as if it could still be stopped. But I knew it wouldn't end now. It was just a pause. After that evening, everything changed, even if we continued to pretend outwardly that nothing had happened. Victor no longer looked at me the way he used to. His gaze was now heavier, more intense, as if there was no longer room for chance in it. I saw how he tried to control himself, how he avoided long moments when we were alone, how his fingers sometimes clenched into a fist when I passed too close. He tried to distance himself, but I knew that was no longer possible. That evening, Mom was late again, and the house was quiet, as if the space itself had adjusted to us, leaving time and space for just the two of us. I came out of the bathroom, wearing a robe that was barely cinched at the waist, my skin still warm from the water, my damp hair hanging heavy on my shoulders. I didn't need to check if he'd heard the bathroom door slam. I knew he had. I walked slowly down the hallway, moving so that my bare feet could be heard on the wooden floor, giving him time to realize that I was there. When I stopped at the kitchen, he was already standing at the table, leaning on it with his hands, looking away but not at me. He knew I was there, but it was as if he was trying to take a break, as if he was trying to keep himself from breaking down. I took a few steps, stopped opposite him, feeling the air boiling between us. Victor was tense, his shoulders were frozen, as if he was struggling with himself, but even through this I saw how his eyes were slowly studying me, no longer hiding it. I moved closer, half a step, leaning the robe part slightly at my hip, but I didn't touch him. I just stood there, waiting, letting him feel the moment, letting him know that he couldn't just walk away anymore, couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. His fingers tightened slowly on the edge of the table, and I watched his chest rise and fall heavily, his breathing deepening as if he was taking in air that he couldn't get enough of. I didn't look away, just waited, feeling every second stretch the tension to its limit. And suddenly he turned sharply, stepped towards me so close that the air between us became impossibly thick. I felt the heat of his body, felt how he seemed to be fighting with himself, how his fingers slowly rose, but did not touch me, how his breath touched my skin, but he still controlled himself. I didn't move, didn't retreat, let the moment last. I knew he wanted to touch, he wanted to break loose, that this was no longer a game, no longer an accident, no longer a quiet provocation. I felt his fingers passing a millimeter from my shoulder, his breathing becoming uneven, his eyes on my lips, but he couldn't allow himself more. The moment lasted an eternity, until he pulled back, until he took a sharp step back, as if pushing away the very possibility of allowing this to happen. I saw his muscles tense, his jaw clench, his eyes close for a second, as if trying to regain control. And then he left, leaving me in this room, leaving me with this heated body, with this pulse thundering in my ears, with this feeling that something irreversible had already happened, even if we had never touched each other. After that night, the house became quieter, but it was not an ordinary silence, but a thick one, filled with something irreversible. Victor avoided me, and when our eyes met by chance, there was no longer any play, no hints, no caution in them, only a tense heaviness that could not be erased. I knew that he was struggling with it, that he was trying to take control, that he was moving away for a reason. He wanted to stop what had long been unstoppable. Mom didn't notice anything, but even if she had, she wouldn't have been able to understand what exactly had happened between us. After all, nothing had happened physically, there were no kisses, no touches, no words that could have become evidence. But I knew that the line had long since been erased, that Victor felt the same, that this was no longer my fantasy or illusion. For several days I tried not to go into the rooms where he might be, not to be alone with him, not to provoke him even with random movements. But the tension did not go away. It hung in the air, accumulated in every gesture, in every word, in every second when he pretended to be busy with something else, but his thoughts were where mine were. One evening, when my mother was working late again, I walked into the kitchen, accidentally bumping into him as he was finishing his coffee. He froze, and I stopped too, not knowing whether I should go further or turn back. His eyes slowly studied me, and in that moment I realized that he was still struggling with himself, that inside him there was still a struggle between what he wanted and what he thought was right. I waited for him to leave again, but he simply exhaled, put his cup down on the table, and walked past without turning around. His steps were quick, sharp, as if he had made some decision, and I knew he would not allow himself to repeat that night. Victor kept himself in check because if he allowed this to happen again, he would not be able to stop. I went back to my room, lay down on my bed, looked at the ceiling, and tried to figure out what to do now. It had already happened, even if it couldn't be put into words. I knew he remembered every moment, every look, every second when there was no air left between us. I knew he was lying in his room, not sleeping, unable to erase it from his memory. But now there is a wall between us again. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: this would never be just a stepdaughter and stepfather relationship again. It was something else. Something that couldn't be explained. Something that will now remain between us forever.